Aloha and welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Lynette Cruz. I'm your host for this program. And the title of today's program is called Privatizing ʻāina. I have one wonderful guest and I have a co-host who's going to help me actually direct the conversation so we get the most information that we can out of our guests because there's a lot there. My co-host first to my right is Nanette Napoleon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lynette.
And then to Nanette's right is our special guest, Umi Perkins, who is actually going to share about himself, what he does, where he does it, all the things that are relevant to understanding who he is and why he happens to be on this program tonight. Welcome, Umi.
Thank you for having me, Mahalo. I think people know some of my sort of 50-word bio. I have a PhD in political science from UH Manoa. I have a master's from Harvard. But since we're talking about ʻāina, I thought it's always appropriate to talk about my family's relationship to a particular ʻāina. And that is, my mother is Hawaiian, my father's not. Both of my mother's parents are Hawaiian and goes back to Hawaii Island, Hamakua and Puna. But more recently, both sides basically moved to Lahaina, and then eventually my grandparents settled in Makaha, and my parents still live in Makaha. My father's from Massachusetts. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, actually, where my father's from, and moved here when I was 2. My mother was a PhD student. She was a fellow at the East-West Center. That's kind of what brought us back. And so I grew up in Hawaii, but then when I was 9, we moved to Tonga. So I had this experience of living in a very traditional Polynesian country. One of the tourist slogans for the Kingdom of Tonga is visit the 19th century, come to Tonga. So I got this sort of a feeling of what it might have been like to live here, more than 100 years ago. Because Tonga in the 1980s was kind of like Hawaii in the 1880s. In fact, the Constitution, it was a constitutional monarchy. Constitutions were the same word for word in some cases. So when I was 14, my brother and I moved back, and we became boarders at Lahaina Luna. So I graduated from Lahaina Luna, went to college in California. I started teaching, and then I went to graduate school, starting at Harvard, and then eventually back here at UH Manoa. I have a pretty diverse interests. I have a blog called the Umiverse that a lot of people have been reading, and there's a variety of topics on there, including music. I'm actually a musician. A lot of people don't know that, but I'm kind of a generalist, but I've had to focus to be able to get through academia, and what I ended up focusing on was land, both for my master's thesis and PhD dissertation. That's what brought us to the topic of privatizing ʻāina. I actually first started studying privatization before I started studying ʻāina. I wrote a pretty major report when I was working for a think tank in Boston about privatization in general. It's sort of a right-wing conservative effort to take services out of government control and put them into private provision by private companies. So this theme of privatization is something I'd been looking at before I really focused on ʻāina. And so that's where the title kind of comes from, Privatizing ʻāina. That's not the title of my dissertation, but it's the title of an article that I'm working on based on the dissertation.
Wow. Thank you for sharing all that, because when I say that I'm going to have you introduce yourself, I'm also assuming I'm going to learn stuff. I just learned a whole bunch of stuff. I didn't know that you were born in Boston. I didn't know that you were at the East-West Center. I was too. There's all kinds of stuff. I mean, your mom was.
Yeah, I kind of grew up behind the East West Center in the garden area as a little kid. So I was always surrounded by intellectuals, and it was a very kind of rich way to grow up.
Yes. Why?
What was your mother's academic focus?
It was anthropology, basically. I mean, specifically folklore. She did a dissertation on chants, on Hawaiian chants, which led her to almost a lifelong study of the kumalipo, which she's still working on. She's been retired from the university system for quite a while.
What's your mother's name?
Lealoha Apo Perkins.
Apo Perkins.
Yeah, so that's my family going back to Hawaii and Lahaina is the Makekaus, which became the Apos. So again, another thing people might not know about me is that I'm an Apo actually. Peter Apo is my mother's younger brother.
Oh.
So that's been kind of the context I was raised. My grandmother is Margaret Apo, who's actually named Ka'a'a, and so there was sort of politics was in my family. She was on the school board for 17 years.
I actually remember reading something that she wrote to the newspaper many, many years ago about
she did a lot of that.
About
what?
Yeah. About pigeon.
Pigeon.
And about how negative that it was for people to speak pidgin. I recall reading that, and I was just like, what?
Yeah.
Different
Well,
era.
here we are,
Different
right? This is how
era.
we grew up.
My mother, in contrast, became one of the first sort of literary people in Hawaii to write in pidgin. So there was
All good. It balances out.
difference of opinion there. Yeah.
So also I wanted you to introduce yourself. So thank you for that, and then we'll get back to the privatizing ʻāina part very shortly. Who are you?
Who am I? I'm a freelance historical research by trade, which means people hire me to help them do research, not strictly on Hawaiian history, anything to do with Hawaii history. So they might be writing a book, a research thing that they're doing, writing a newspaper article, making a film. They come here, they start their research in the various repositories, but they can't afford to stay as long as they need to. So it's a long story. They end up contacting me via email, tell me what their topic is. I tell them what my fees are, and we make an agreement. And they give me their topic, and I go looking for their information. But most people know me as the cemetery lady, because I've been studying historic graveyards in Hawaii for over 30 years now.
Right. So that's why you're here, is because I know that you have a lot of questions as I about what this privatizing ʻāina topic is about. And so we'll just turn it over to you, because you need to tell us.
Okay. I'm working off of notes here. And I've done this presentation in other places, but I think I have time to really go in depth today.
You have time. We'll just not talk.
No, please do. I started out the dissertation in a kind of a little bit of a subversive way. I started looking at the book called The Fundamental Laws of Hawaii, written by Lauren Thurston in 1904. And the reason is it sort of gets into my methodology, which is called genealogy. He gives a kind of a chronology or genealogy or a lineage of law in Hawaii, starting with the Constitution of 1840, which is, some people could disagree that that's where law begins in Hawaii, but it's more or less a reasonable place to start, Constitution of 1840. And then he traces the constitutions. It's fairly standard, 1852, 64, and bayonet, which of course he thinks is legitimate. But then it gets really interesting once you get to the Republic period. One of the fundamental laws he lists is the treaty annexing Hawaii to the United States in 1897, and then the resolution of the Hawaiian Senate ratifying the treaty, and then the joint resolution annexing Hawaii in 1898. So you don't have to know too much about Hawaiian history to realize Hawaii wasn't annexed twice. If there had been a treaty of annexation in 1897, you wouldn't need a joint resolution to annex it again in 1898. So what you see here is a kind of a radical break in the sequence of historical, the sort of historical narrative that leads us to where we are, or where we think we are. How did we get here? That sequence of events is full of these breakages. So when I say genealogy, I don't just mean it in the sense of lineage, one thing follows another. It's sort of a, this is where it gets kind of academic. The philosophers Friedrich Nietzsche and Michel Foucault, when they sort of deploy the term genealogy, they mean the opposite of sequence. They mean rupture. They mean breakages that often we base our identities on some kind of narrative that leads back to a glorious origin, Kumalipo, for example. But when you actually investigate and trace that lineage, it does not connect. And that's what they mean by genealogy. So I created a kind of hybrid methodology. Noe Goodyear Kaupua had sort of started this out with her research. I sort of took it one more step, looking at how do these two senses of genealogy work together? How do they sort of resonate? And that was sort of the underlying methodology. But the point is to say that we don't actually know the history. We have, it's very problematic. So I look at ʻāina, and it sort of said this in the introduction, that ʻāina is, for Hawaiians, is something you're related to. For settlers, it's a commodity. It's real estate. It's a financial asset. But for both, it's power. ʻāina, and this was pointed out by Cooper and Dawes in the book Land and Power in Hawaii, 1985, that land was power for Kamehameha I. Tomorrow was Kamehameha Day. Land is still power today. When we look at the development of Kaka'ako and who are the players in that, it's very clear that land has always been power. So I think it's appropriate that my dissertation is in the field of political science, which really studies not government but power itself. How does power actually function? And land is very much a piece of that. So in looking at that idea of genealogy, I look at David Malo. David Malo said in the Emerson translation of his writings, it's very surprising to hear how contradictory are the accounts given by the ancients of the origins of the land here in Hawaii. It is in their genealogies that we shall see the disagreement in this regard. So what I'm seeing there is a kind of comfort with the idea that origin is not singular but plural, that there are always multiple accounts of origin stories. Lilikala Kamelehiva says, "It is inevitable that human memory makes for error, and when comparing various versions of genealogies, discrepancies do occur. However, such discrepancies are less important than the received mana of the names." So again, it brings us back to this idea of power, that it's the power that's asserted by recounting your genealogy that's more important than actual whether it's accurate or not. So I don't want to get too technical, but I looked at this topic with kind of a lens that I call theoretical encounter, which is really asking the question, what happens when ideas meet? So I looked a lot about Captain Cook, about what happened sort of on the beach when two worldviews kind of come into contact or collide, you might say. And so I'm taking it to the point of looking at what happens when ideas about land collide. And that's what this is about. So I looked at traditional Hawaiian land tenure, which I found is very much understudied in Hawaii. Often if you read a book about Hawaiian land, they'll have one paragraph about traditional Hawaiian land tenure. It was like this. It was feudal. It was kind of feudal. And then they just move on to the mahele, basically. So I wanted to look more deeply because I've found that, in Moffat and Fitzpatrick say, scholars have presented too simplistic a picture of land use in Hawaii. that it was a much more complex and dynamic system than we've thought. So I started looking at multiple sources of information, things like mele and oli, and how do they depict land. And that's where I seem to see the idea that land is something you have a kind of affective relationship with. It's this emotional connection to land that's absent from Western, the settler kind of concept. So for example, Carlos Andrade, who I think kind of epitomizes this as a songwriter and a scholar, he has a great quote in the beginning of his book where he says that, talking about ʻāina, ʻāina is a place situated below the wind, close to the taproot of the earth, where the sun enters the sea at Halilea. ʻāina is also where the mountain Makana calls as if it were a sweetheart. So you rarely see that kind of depiction of land in sort of non-native sources. So I was really looking at a Hawaiian conception of land, also Hawaiian perception of land. How do they experience land kind of by their senses? And then I started to look at what I call the moral political economy. So when missionaries arrive, and especially people like William Richards, he was a translator, and I don't mean literally he was a translator of English texts into Hawaiian, most famously Elements of Political Economy by Francis Wayland, but more metaphorically he was a translator of concepts. So when he came up with this idea of the three paths to Western mana, Christianity, capitalism, and Western government and law, it was sort of proving to the Hawaiians what's valuable in this Western way of doing political economy. Basically, he ended up forming a school of capitalism, but the school was very much infused with moralistic ideas that cultivating the land to the greatest extent possible was sort of the right thing to do in a moral way. And I question that, because we find that even in the United States, pretty close to this time, 1820s, people were questioning capitalism back in the United States, and yet it's already being exported here. You know, in 1820, there was a publication in the U.S. that said that stock market trading is nothing but gambling, and that it was pretty soon afterwards that it became standard economic practice, right? So, and now we kind of accept that that's what conservative people do, when actually it's kind of a radical thing. It's like, I mean, we hardly ever call it gambling. What they were doing was, well, what I'm trying to show is that these ideas that were being brought to Hawaii were, as they were being brought here, they were changing. Including, so the idea of feudalism. Feudalism is something, it's a word that's kind of thrown around, but I found that the feudal period is such a long period that there were stages of feudalism, and we don't usually look at it in that kind of nuanced way. That we just think feudalism, exploitation, but when people were describing Hawaiian land tenure as feudal, it was really describing the fact that it had layers, and Hawaiian land tenure did have layers. In fact, that's one of the things that people today don't understand, is just how many layers there are. A lot of people know, but they don't think about it altogether. So for example, when we think about land, we just think about fee simple title and maybe leasehold, which is just sort of an extension of fee simple title. But we don't think about the layers on top of that and the layers below. So below that is dominium, and I've talked about this before, but it's the sovereign ownership of land. It's the reason why the government can condemn land, is that they actually own it. And that's the case in every country in the world. And what distinguished Hawaii was that the dominium, the sovereign ownership, had three owners, and that's where you get government, Konohiki and Wakainana. Whereas in England, there's dominium, and the owner is the queen, the monarch. There's only one layer of dominium, and that's the whole British Commonwealth. So somebody, a book by Thomas Cahill, he points out that the largest landowner in the world is the Queen of England, because she still owns Canada and Australia. She owns it at the level of dominium, though. That means, when they don't have fee simple there. When you buy land, you buy what they call a freehold, which sort of emphasizes you're actually holding it. You don't fully own it. You hold it at the will of the sovereign. And that shows you that there is a layer underneath, that the sovereign actually owns it. And then there's layers above. So gathering rights. So gathering rights are usage rights. They're more, they're less fundamental, more nebulous than fee simple, but they really do exist in Hawaii. In fact, after the Pash decision, there was a commission that was set up, the Pash Kohanaiki Study Group. Vicky Takamine Holt was part of that. And their report came out saying that people need to accept that private property doesn't exist in Hawaii in the same way that it does in the continent, which is a pretty radical finding coming from a state-sanctioned commission that all goes back to this multi-layer, multi-level system of land ownership.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
The concept of dominion in Hawaii, with its 3 layers, what's the bottom layer? I mean, which one is at the bottom of those 3?
Well,
you have government, you said, and
of the 3.
Yeah,
within dominium.
Yeah, within.
One place where there was confusion, and this is kind of indirectly answering the question, is there was the king and then there was the government, right? That's a cause of confusion. Now, because there were the crown lands and there were the government lands of the kingdom. The way that I think about it is, so the king controls the government lands in his capacity as head of state, but as an individual, he controls the crown lands.
And the government doesn't have any control over the crown lands.
Right. When I was doing my research in the archives, that lawsuit in the Supreme Court was going on in 2009, really asking about, does the state own the ceded lands? And I'm holding a ledger in my hand that says account book of the private lands of Kamehameha IV. So there's no question that these are private lands. And yet at annexation they're just sort of fused together, and most people know that. But that's a fundamental problem, and that's why John Van Dyke wrote the book Who Owns the Crown Lands in Hawaii, because that's a serious question. His answer is kind of unsatisfactory, that it just automatically somehow magically transfers to the Native Hawaiian governing entity. To me, that doesn't follow any kind of really legal logic. But as far as which level is fundamental, it's sort of like the government holds land in lieu of another owner. And that's how 3 seems to be 4. Because the government is sort of the de facto owner. And in that sense, it's the fundamental owner. But, if you take a step before that, how did these concepts even emerge? This is pretty modern. Right? What happened was the same thing that happened in India. And I looked a lot at India in my research, where they were just taking an Indian concept and they were saying, that sounds like landlord. So I think the term was riyatwar, some kind of owner called riyatwar. And they said, that sounds like a landlord, so we'll just call him landlord. And they became equivalents. And the same thing was happening here, where Konohiki becomes landlord, and ʻāina becomes native tenant. So there was this translation that happened that you could question, but people in the kingdom, Kumeme III, they accepted those translations. So that's a kind of a roundabout way of answering the question.
That's okay. That'll do. I actually get it.
You know that word feudal, I've been interested in that term and how it's used in Hawaiian land tenure for many years. And like you, I see it in all the textbooks, all the generalized textbooks. Short period of Hawaii was feudal and the people were serfs. And I've always had an issue with that, and I want to hear from both of you about that. Because I don't see the Hawaiian system as being a feudal system in that the maka'ainana, the people of the land, who worked the land and lived on the land, had the right to leave their ali'i, their chiefs, and move someplace else if they didn't like the chief. And they had sort of a power in some respects. If they didn't like that chief, they could go to appeal to a higher chief and get this lesser chief kicked out. That if the chief wasn't doing a good job of caring for the land and the people, they could go away and get replaced. So I don't see that system. That's how I see the system, and I don't see it the same as a feudal system, where serfs were pretty much owned by the lords. But maybe I'm wrong.
Lots of stories where people just left. Living was hard. Yeah, I think, who did I hear this from? Some kupuna I interviewed on Hawaii Island, that when Kamehameha's warriors went up north to train, and everybody knew they were coming, they left.
Oh.
Otherwise, they would have been conscripted to provide food,
Right.
and they didn't want to. So they split. So everybody, they know what's coming, they just leave, and good luck to you.
And they weren't penalized or hunted after. That
No,
was
you gotta
their,
catch 'em first.
They had a right to do that. Yeah.
So my position in my research is, of course, Hawaiian land tenure isn't feudal. That's a European system. But what I'm saying is, maybe we shouldn't dismiss the feudal analogy offhand. That really the usefulness of calling it feudal. And in the 1800s, nobody questioned the idea that Hawaiian land tenure was feudal. That's a 20th century thing. And I'm not saying they were right. I'm saying that it was useful in this bridging of the two kind of concepts. It's also useful just in terms of understanding the layers that the king ultimately controls land, and then it's control of land below the king is kind of at the pleasure of the king. In that sense, it was similar to feudal, but of course it wasn't literally feudal. Also, feudalism had these phases. One was more military, and then another phase is more just blatant exploitation. And we tend to, when we hear the word feudal, we tend to think of the exploitation phase, but Hawaiian land tenure might have been more like the military in terms of loyalty, not necessarily in terms of providing military, because Andrade questions that again. So that's all I'm saying in my work is don't dismiss it out of hand.
But in the absence of a common vocabulary, you gotta use something.
Right.
That's, I guess, everybody's speaking English.
And that brings us to this concept of Kuleana, where I think a lot of the misunderstanding comes from just the straight translation of that word. When we say Kuleana, sort of a banal use of it in a school, for example, I don't know, Kamehameha schools, we say, remember you have your Kuleana, do this and do your homework and all of this. But Kuleana, if you look at the definition, there's several parts to it. Responsibility, rights, and in the Andrews and even the Puku'i dictionary, it says a small piece of property within someone else's land. That's a definite. It's sitting right there. Nobody's really traced back to that. So I started my chapter on Kuleana with that. And the title of the dissertation is Kuleana because I think it's important for us to go back to these original concepts. What is the original word? What did it actually mean? Not just use a translation, responsibility. Because, you know, again, to use a high school analogy, we always tell the teenagers, you have rights and then you have responsibilities that come along with it. Well, for Hawaiians, it's the same word. It's like the Chinese idea of crisis and opportunity, just the same, two sides of the same thing. That's very profound. I mean, I mentioned History Day before we started taping. The theme for National History Day this year is rights and responsibility. And so I was having my students work on a Kuleana because it's both right together, embedded. So I think that kind of gives us an idea of a Hawaiian way of thinking that those two things are kind of implicitly connected. But if I can just go on, because this is kind of the crux of the dissertation, is this idea of Kuleana, native tenant rights. What happened in the sort of late 20th century is a sort of a sleight of hand that native tenant rights were emphasized as being gathering rights. And it's true, they were, but like all rights in land, Kuleana were a bundle of rights. You know, when you buy a piece of property, you have a bundle of rights. You have the right to use it, you have the right to exclude people, you have the right to enjoy it with limitations. There's a whole set of rights that you have. They use the term bundle. Kuleana is the same. One of those bundle of rights is gathering rights. But the more fundamental one is the actual ability to get a fee simple title. That you're born with the right to own land, not buy it. You already own it when you're born. That's what the Kuleana Act did, was to provide a process by which people would divide out their vested rights, so they call it, and get a fee simple title. And yet in the 1990s with the Pash decision and all of that, it's like the courts were saying, look over here, gathering rights. When the real action was, it's like a magician, right? They do a sleight of hand, distract your attention to here. Gathering rights, the fundamental action is down under the table. You can actually get a fee simple title. Nobody's even really thinking about that. And the question of whether or not you can get a fee simple title through these Kuleana rights depends on this idea of a deadline. And to me, the deadline is really that's that sort of gray area, that smoking gun. I think some of the work that Kanusai and others have done since the 90s is to try to sort of activate those Kuleana rights. You know, right now, today, in this system that we're in, and that's the really tricky part. The question of the deadline is an interesting one, and I could go into it in depth or just touch on it. Basically, it comes down to what was written in the newspapers that Makainana had 2 years to claim their rights. Right? So they published it in February 1846, and they said by February 1848 you had to have made your claim. So you write your claim, and then two neighbors, they file their claims, and somehow without a postal service it gets to Honolulu, to the Land Commission.
Right.
And that's just an accepted principle in real estate law, that there was this 2-year deadline. On the other hand, everybody knows that the deadline for chiefs was extended to 1895, and eventually extended to 1909. Now, there were only 255 koneviki, 252. There were 88,000 makainana in the 1840s, and yet they only get 2 years to divide out all their interests, and the chiefs get, 70 years. Is there something not right here? There's also the fact that the legislation that that set that date was actually referring to people who already owned land before the Mahele. And in the Bishop Museum, I actually found documents signed by Kawikiaole and William Richards of land ownership in 1839.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So there is land ownership before 1845.
And who granted it?
They, so chiefs would, there was this process of chiefs rewarding foreigners often with land, right? And in my previous research on New Zealand, the Maori would do that. They would sort of give away land as an act of mana. They would sort of sweep their hand. And Hawaiians did it too. This is yours.
Right.
The fact that you can do that is your mana. And sometimes they would actually, the Maori chiefs would do that for somebody else's land. Be like, see, that land was mine. Look, I gave it away. That's an act of, because for Polynesians, it's like giving and receiving is just two parts of the same interaction. It's sort of like the stock market where you can buy first or you can sell first. It's the same process, kind of like rights and responsibilities. It's reciprocal.
Two early foreigners that come to my mind when you're talking about that is Isaac Davis and John Young, who were foreigners, but stayed here and became close advisors to King Kamehameha I. And because of that, they weren't. I can't remember both of them. I know John Young was actually given a chiefly title, and they both got land,
right.
And they both married Hawaiians.
And people like that was the reason why there was a third form of land ownership in that middle level: fee simple, leasehold, and then life estates. The life estate, in my understanding, was a way to give land to foreigners as compensation, out of gratitude, and reward them, but not reward all their descendants, just them.
Oh.
So at the end of your life, it reverts. It reverts back to what they call the remaindermen, whoever owned it before, which is often the government. And yet what happened when Hawaiian language started to go by the wayside is the translation for the word life estate in Hawaiian got lost, got glossed over. Life estate in Hawaiian is, I think it's makeano, malalo okeano alodio, less than alodio, less than fee simple. That's a life estate. It's
so then
it's sub fee simple.
The lands that were awarded to Davis and Young, when the Mahele comes, did they have to, and the Kuleana Act, did they have to go and sign the papers, or they just didn't have to do any of that?
I think I know with John Young, what happened is because John Young married Kamehameha's niece, his children are chiefs and they're in the Mahele. So Keoneana is a Mahele chief. So there was an inheritance in that case. And I think when they got land, it's before this system was kind of worked out. But I think you can see it's quite complex. Interesting thing is that I started studying land because I thought it would be much more straightforward and black and white than, say, sovereignty, which is what I was very much interested in. Thought, sovereignty is kind of nebulous. It's a political question. So focus on something concrete, land. But then what I found was the basis of the system that says you can actually own something rests on sovereignty again. So it looped back around again to sovereignty, which is what I wanted to sort of talk about at the end, that this idea of land ownership, title, being black and white. Either you own it or you don't own it. I thought, that's what I thought. It ends up coming back around to under which government are you owning, and are they going to recognize and let you exercise your rights? Because that's the really interesting thing about land in Hawaii, is that the laws of the kingdom are the laws that we're still using, right? That's what privatizing ʻāina in 1845, 1848 means, that it's privatized from then all the way till now. There was never, the overthrow doesn't affect really land. It's not a new system, it's the same system. And yet, because there was an overthrow, we're in a situation now where probably the courts don't want to allow those rights to continue to exist. Because if we find that there was no deadline on native tenant rights and people start filing these claims, then it sets a precedent of every ʻāina, every Hawaiian can divide out their interest. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about that. That's where it gets to not so clear.
Actually,
there's
lots
a
of
lot
things,
of a lot of topics to talk about here.
Because this stuff really has implications for how people think about land ownership today.
Yeah.
Under what government are you claiming ownership? Because the reality is, a lot of people live in Hawaii who believe that they own their property, they own their land, and so we may be on the verge, I certainly hope so, of shifting things. And then the question, the one that you just raised, is really under what system of land ownership are we operating? What's really going on, and who owns what? Mm-hmm. All that stuff is up in the air, or is it?
It'd be really interesting to see if people start asserting those rights, and they already are. I mean, Kale Gumapak, right, he's been getting a lot of attention. That's essentially what he's doing, is using native tenant rights as a way to avoid foreclosure. But I can foresee a court saying that this form of land ownership that I'm talking about, which is the kingdom's land ownership that comes all the way to today, nobody denies that there's never been a break in that. There really isn't. But they could say that form of land ownership is inconsistent with the understanding that people have when they buy land.
Today.
Whose fault is that?
Right. Yeah. Buyer beware, due diligence. But we're not even at that level, really, except for Kale and I guess Keanusai is a consultant for him. And a few other people scattered around who know about these things. I think there's some people on Maui. But yeah, the picture of what the system was like is only starting to become clear. That's why this nation building effort is very crucial. I wrote a blog post that was called the Race for Nationhood, because I'm seeing developments on the federal recognition side. There's things that are happening that most people don't even know about, that they're moving in that direction. It's genuine progress, on that track. And then there's also progress on the independence track. Hawaii is apparently going to be listed by an academy in Geneva, pretty credible international law academy, as an occupied state. So it's like the two sides, maybe unknowingly, are sort of racing towards a future of, well, what is it going to look like? But things like this are, something like this is at stake in terms of what is the resolution of that. And I've been thinking more about, it's not just a race for nationhood, it's really a race for the meaning of nationhood. What does it actually mean? There have been some debates about that. My understanding is the nation is just the people, that there's already a Hawaiian nation. No matter what its status is, there is a Hawaiian nation, but there's no government, or there's governments who simply acted and declared to be governments, multiple, but those are subject to critique, obviously, whereas the nation is not. Other people disagree. They say the nation is the state. But land is kind of at the center of these debates, and yet it's not really being talked about that much.
I have a question about the Mahele and King Kamehameha's the third role in that, because a lot of times historians, modern day historians, will say, oh, you know, why did he go for this plan, and criticize all the monarchs for giving away the land, essentially, that it was their fault. They had it in their control to stop this different kind of Western land system coming in and enveloping us. But how do you see that? And have you ever heard that?
Oh, yeah. So, you know, a lot of the critique that came from the 80s and 90s, I've sort of done a genealogy of that, you know. Marion Kelly, people like that. Marion Kelly was a Marxist. I mean, straight up, she was a member of the Communist Party. So there's this kind of Marxist gloss to the research that sort of says that the problem was capitalism, and the Hawaiian society was somehow more communitarian, if not communist, it was communitarian. And so there's a sort of implicit assumption that Hawaiians would have been more communitarian and not capitalist. But if you look at the historical context, that really doesn't work. The Mahele happened the same year that the Communist Manifesto was published, 1848. So there was no possibility of communism in Hawaii as they were forming the government, as they were forming the land system. It was just too late. Communism as an idea was too late. So to me, that's historically out of context. There was capitalism, or just trying to hold off the ships, so to speak. There was no real other option. So they adopted the system as the only viable option to sort of integrate into the world political economic system, because the other option is just colonization, which they're seeing happening in New Zealand. Treaty of Waitangi is 1840, where Maori arguably sign over their sovereignty to the British. Kamehameha III sends the envoys in 1842 to Britain, France, and the United States to get recognition of Hawaii's sovereignty. That's to me, that's not a coincidence. He sees what's going on, and he's choosing to sort of become part of the world system. And so communism is not an option on that plate. You know, in joining that, you can't be communitarian. You have to be capitalist. On the other hand, capitalism is pretty new at the time. In fact, I don't think people realize how new the idea of owning private property for normal people was only about 1 or 1.5 generations old by the time it's happening here. So it's still a new idea that they're developing.
Right.
And that's true of all these ideas. They're still in flux. And only now are we starting to see some of the fundamental flaws in the model, right? That 2008, the collapse, and then now with this book by Thomas Piketty that people are talking about, Capitalism in the 21st Century. He's saying that there's a fundamental problem that we're headed for revolutions if capitalism isn't reformed. So certainly the critiques of capitalism are valid, but Hawaiians are kind of in a position of having to make a choice, and that's what they chose. And it was actually considering the constraints that were on them. They did pretty well. It took scholars kind of several generations to even figure out what they were doing. To me, that's kind of amazing.
Questions? You know, actually, I'm like absorbing all. You know, so I'm not really thinking about questions. I'm just like, what? Early on, you started by talking about ʻāina as power. And then you talked a little bit about Kuleana. And I wondered if there might be how those terms are connected to each other. Yes, power. Absolutely. But more than that. Not just power to do whatever you want to do, or power to make people do whatever you want them to do, but also a tremendous Kuleana for taking care.
Yeah.
I got that sense, but I didn't hear you comment on that.
No, I thought a lot about that. I mean, in New Zealand, and the Maori have a concept called ahika, which is the people who keep the home fires burning. In New Zealand society, in general, they're so small and isolated, or they see themselves that way, that what they call the OE, the overseas experience, is supposed to be part of a normal sort of upbringing. But for Maori, it's a tricky situation. Somebody has to stay home all the time and keep the home fires burning, keep the marae running, keep the tribe together. And the same is true for Hawaiians, that there are those who stay, those who are caretakers of certain places, that it's in their family to do so. And for me, I mean, I went away, so I'm not someone who's keeping the home fires burning. And it's not something to necessarily judge that one's better or worse, but at least see that there are these different roles. And if you are someone who stays, you don't have access to some of the things that the high flyers do. You're not gonna go to Oxford or something like that. But you have power in the sense that you are the person connected to the place, and we have a lot of those people. At my dissertation defense, some of the committee members were saying, what does that look like here? How can people divide out their interest now? And it just got me to think, like, it would be those people. They would be the ones, if you take the law literally that you have to be cultivating the area, you can't be someone living on the 50th floor of a high-rise and then get native tenant rights. You have to be someone planting or caring for a heiau or something like that. It's those people. So
Thanks for bringing that up. I just say that I'm commenting on this, what you just said, because that's a real issue. That is an issue. And we see it playing out in terms of a claiming of rights for people who could not, for whatever reason, keep the home fires burning. They can't. But the feeling is that they don't want to be denied something that the rest of us have simply by virtue of keeping the home fires burning. This is really good for me because it gives me a different way to think about and talk about those kinds of issues. Believe me,
when you're talking about that 2-year deadline to claim your property, Hawaiians were still very rural. They lived in Waipio Valley in the middle of the boondocks, and they didn't have the wherewithal to travel all the way to a district place and they weren't literate yet, and so it was really, really unfair to put that kind of timeline, I think, on those things, and that came into play in many other things, not just land, but in voting rights and many other things. They got excluded because they couldn't do it.
Yeah, Malcolm. I talked to Malcolm Chun about this, and he told me something very interesting. Which was that David Malo in the legislature was actually the one arguing for maka'inana rights. A lot of the chiefs in the legislature don't want maka'inana to do as the definition of Kuleana says, pull a piece of land out of their property. If you look at Kuleana, there are these landlocked little
pockets,
these pieces, because they're pulled out of somebody's larger mahele grant. But you have that tension between the classes then. And Emmett Lee Loy, I think it was, wrote an article, an op-ed in the Honolulu Advertiser back in the 90s that he said, blame Ali'i for land loss. There is a little bit of truth for that. You see it in the Privy Council record with Kekuana. He's kind of appalled by how little land he's going to end up with at the end because he's such a low-ranking, he's a kaukau ali'i, end up with like 1 ʻāina.
Self-interest in the end. Really. It just, now's a really good time because we're just about out of time. Is there some pressing thing that you think that you want to leave us with? And then I said earlier that sometimes we have persons coming in more than once. You should come again. I don't think we touched nearly as much as we could have.
It went quickly. I did want to bring it back to this nation building question. You know, what is it's genealogy again, what is the sequence of events that has led us here? I know that the federal recognition people are working on sort of recasting the history in a way that will make Hawaiians look amenable towards federal recognition, and to me that's a serious issue. But also there are bigger issues like globalization that if we do start moving towards some kind of autonomy, whatever form that would take, you have to think about issues that transcend national boundaries. Global warming, obviously. Go to Kona, all the historic sites on the coast could be underwater. That's a serious issue for Hawaiians. And yet we're so small and have so little control over this kind of global phenomenon. The globalization of the real estate market, you know, they're talking about property, the average house reaching $800,000 by 2016. That's a global, that's money coming in. That's not, who can make that much money here?
And I think we're going to probably want to save all of that stuff for the next one, because we are actually running out of time. So let me just thank you, Umi, for coming tonight and sharing your information, and Lynette.
I wasn't expecting to be here, but
That's okay, but you know, you're here, right?
Okay.
So, and thank you guys for joining us for Issues That Matter, and I learned a lot.
Yeah, me too.
All for having me.
Thank you.
I get nervous when people tell me that they know. Well, actually, they don't know. They can't know at all. And I think our responsibility is to make sure that information surfaces and we can have a larger discussion and know more. So thank you for coming. And thank you to all you guys that are watching out there. I'm Lynette Cruz for Issues That Matter. And this is number 4 in a series that we're doing. And if you don't mind, you can be number 4 and 5.
Part 2.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah, part 2. And we'll see you guys again.